um, how
Sorry.
can we determine the inner possibility of metaphysics? It's not, this is of course not straight away. I don't think we can rely on strictly Heideggerian what's that word?
Ontology, mumbo jumbo.
No, the other thing, the other thing, the thing about where knowledge comes from. Yeah, theory of knowledge. And so we can't rely on a theory of knowledge. We certainly can't. He later makes a lot of statements about can't consider the critique as a theory of knowledge. We have to be very careful about assuming that the critique is a theory of knowledge. So so the ground laying is the letting forth, which he did talk about in Being in Time, but it's the importance that there's a metaphysics in the critique that needs to be exposed and investigated, and he says that in the 4 points at the end. Carry the starting point. And then the carrying out of laying a ground, not undermining. I disagree with David in that. I don't think this is necessarily an undermining, but it is a critique of the critique, no question about that. It's going to be that, and then the understanding the originality of concept. In other words, actually investigating what it is that was original, that wasn't already described in the original metaphysics, and then retrieving information from Kant and possibly from other philosophy, retrieval. So this is the methodology that he hopes to, fourfold methodology that he hopes to bring to light. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, James. Brent.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, we can. Go for it.
Okay. So anyway, on the last sentence of the paragraph that you read, or the last paragraph, talks about, let me see what it said, that the projection of the inner possibility of metaphysics thus necessarily is a matter of letting the supporting power of the already laid ground become operative. First, the already laid ground may be here possibly reference to traditional metaphysics. However, I think it says more than that. There's a supporting power of the already laid ground of metaphysics. And that's what we are looking for. And I think there's another meaning to this sentence in the sense that he used the word already laid. And of course, you know, Heidegger uses throughout Being in Time the word always already. Dasein is always already being in the world. So there is a primordial supporting power that is already there. That is the ground of metaphysics. Not only the metaphysics which we will be addressing later on, but the metaphysics that has already been laid down in traditional metaphysics. And that in all of these metaphysical systems, whether it's Aristotle's or Plato's or Descartes' or Nietzsche's or Marx or whatever, there's a supporting power which is underneath all of them. And that's what we are looking for. And I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of this, but in a sense, possibly, when Heidegger says always already, he is talking about the a priori. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Brent. Great. Phil.
Yeah, I want to thank what both Dave and Brent said, but I took it more directly in relationship to Kant. And I thought you have to have a foundation, a structure, in order to understand the beings or the objects within that field. And when I read this, the first thing that came to mind was the Higgs boson. in order to understand the Higgs boson, you have to, in a sense, have a projected understanding of the Higgs field. Otherwise, the Higgs boson may appear, but you don't know what the hell it is. But the Higgs field, it's intertwined with the definition of what the Higgs boson is. So that the relationship between the ground and the figure is an important relationship that ties, if you want to go back to Plato, the form and the I guess the object. So I just took it on that level. I just took without going to the critique itself. So he's laying a foundation in which I guess he's going to critique later. But he's sort of saying this is what Kant is saying. This is actually what, in some sense, science is building a foundation, which is quite different from what Heidegger is going to lay down.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I like the discussion in the opening part. So I guess I'm feeling pretty good about that section. If no one else wants to say anything there, okay. It looks like someone does. Tarek, and then we can move on. Go for it, Tarek.
Thank you so much. What I have understood by that particular paragraph is, it is actually what Heidegger is trying to say here, is actually what is the being of such epistemological thinking of Kant. That is, we know, like when Heidegger, in the question concerning technology, what he did actually, like he told the essence of technology is not the technology itself. So far I can remember, it was enframing. So this was the essence. What is the essence? The inner constituent element. That's what ground laying means. This is what I understood by this sentence. It's a Heideggerian way of exploring the ontology. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarek. Now, scooting along to page 4. So far away, starting in part 1. Okay. Let's start with Aristotle. Where is Aristotle? Here we go. Talking about metaphysics. Let me see the note. No. Yes. Okay. Here we go. Aristotle. It is known that the initial purely technical meaning of the expression meta physica, the collective term for those of Aristotle's treatises that were arranged in sequence after those belonging to the physics, later became a philosophically interpreted characteristic of what is contained in these rearranged treatises. This change of meaning, however, is not as harmless as people ordinarily think. Rather, it channeled the interpretation of these treatises in a specific direction, and thereby the interpretation determined what Aristotle treated as metaphysics. Nevertheless, we must ask whether what is brought together in Aristotelian metaphysics is metaphysics. Admittedly, Kant himself still wants to assign a substantial meaning directly to the expression. As far as the name metaphysics is concerned, it is not to be believed that it arose by chance because it fits so exactly with the science. Now, physis is called nature, but we can arrive at the concept of nature in no other way than through experience. So that the science which follows from it is called metaphysics, meta, trans, and physica. It is a science that is, so to speak, outside of the field of physics, which lies on the other side of it. What was I interested in here? So I guess this might have been, maybe I had a wrong note here. What is the inside issue? Oh,
It's kind of self-explanatory, but yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I feel like I don't know why I brought us here. Sorry about that. I guess what. Yeah, it is kind of self-explanatory. That's kind of a bad place to go to. I'm sorry about that. Let me keep on reading. There's another part on this page. Okay. Yeah, go for it, David S. You want to put a comment there?
Well, the one thing is he's saying there's the word trans, the traveling, the meta beyond, maybe he's making a point that there is such a gap between these things that there's a leap we're making from experience to physics, like our experience to the world. So that gap has to be explained. So this was a worthwhile paragraph. From our senses to the world is a trip, and that's a crossing over. So the fact that it's beyond physics, it was apt that it was volumes that were not part of the physics books. It was, it's an interesting observation. It's not worthless.
Yeah. So I like that then, because then it kind of leads to the discussion of what exactly are we doing here. So if you understand it like you were saying with that that movement, past physics, it seems like metaphysics, and he says it at one point too, metaphysics is part of human nature, because it seems like to be a very interpretive type of activity. It's almost like you thinking about what happens in the physica.
Well, if it's going to take us from the world to knowledge, there still may be a gap between those things, which is us. We're still traveling, right? So that's the discussion. How do we get from the world to our knowledge?
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. Brent, go for it.
Yeah, Aristotle, to my understanding, never used the word metaphysics, metaphysica, and he did not even know of the word. The early Christian editors of Aristotle's works were confounded as to where to put a set of notes by Aristotle. They noticed that it was sort of similar to the treatise Physics by Aristotle, but it dealt with the subject in a slightly different way. Of course, physics was about physis, and consequently the beings, or the being of beings, whereas these notes dealt with the subject in a slightly different way. There they talk about metaphysics, or Aristotle talks about metaphysics as the king or queen of all the sciences, the source of all the other sciences. So right there, Aristotle, puts the physics as a metaphysica specialis, whereas he puts metaphysics in and of itself as a metaphysica generalis. And, but, the meta in metaphysica, it can mean after. So the editors put the metaphysics of these notes, they put them after the physics. And that's how they interpreted meta. It's after the physics. But in line with the prevailing interpretation of Aristotle by, by these Christian editors and by scholastic philosophy, gradually what happened is that the word meta gradually migrated from meaning after the physics to meaning beyond the physical. And Heidegger says that no, metaphysics is not this type of, the metaphysics of Aristotle is not this type of beyond the physical. It's not that type of metaphysics. And the question is it even metaphysics at all? Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Apparently the section does spark conversation. Go for it, Phil.
I want to thank Brent for bringing the history of that interpretation, because now I sort of understand it better. When I first read this, I thought that there was a kind of assertion that somehow thinking was superior than the world in some sense. And my thought was that this seems to involve that thinking somehow is after something that's more than the world, or at least the appearance of the world that we can understand. And I use the word that what the mind wants is beyond the beyond. And so that was interesting. And what Brent says really allow me to fit in what I said beyond the beyond is, because that's exactly what the Christians were thinking. In some sense, it's beyond the physics and beyond the beyond. So I think that makes sense. It was the medievals that turned it into this sort of like transcendental sort of thing. So Yeah, and the mind is the only thing that perhaps, and the Christians actually didn't think that, but perhaps that have access to beyond the beyond. So thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Phil. David Godkin.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for this because I really like this paragraph. And when I settled, I actually found myself settling into it when I read it, because it seemed to remind me about my understanding of what metaphysics is, at least I guess in the classical sense. At the same time, I agree with James to a certain degree. It is somewhat self-explanatory, but then the more that people were working with that, I said, well, maybe that's not so. It's so that's what I find very, very quite curious and quite intriguing about this. I've always taken the notion of metaphysics as is relatively straightforward. I don't know the precise etymology of the word, but and somebody will, I'm sure will correct me, but I always thought it was beyond the physical. And that this seems to be mirrored in what the last line here, which it is a science that is, so to speak, outside the field of physics, and for that matter, outside the field of outside of experience, which lies on the other side of it. It's and to a certain degree, and this sort of what Dave seems to be suggesting in terms of this gap between the world and us, and what we make of the world. There is this discussion within the critique about, can we actually ascertain a meaning to the objective reality around us? And there is the sense, in fact, that no, it's impossible for reasons that become apparent. But that's the way that I've understood the notion of metaphysics in a very, very elementary way. And that's what I'm very, very intrigued. As I say, I'm repeating myself here, but this is really quite a fact. And it's really, really important to know this. And we're getting down to I'm going to use the word, we're getting down to real basics here, and that's what we're talking about anyway, about what do we mean by metaphysics. And we have the other book by Heidegger, what is metaphysics, and it's a word which has always really, really, really puzzled me. But yeah, I think it's a basic concept that we have to almost wrestle with, and then in its variations before we can actually move much further, I think. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, David. David S.
Yeah, I think a good framework is what Brent said, that this is just a bunch of books on a shelf, and physics was at the end of the shelf, and they had a few more books to add, so they called it metaphysics. It didn't mean anything fundamental about ontology. It just was a descriptive term. And then, it became scholastically developed because it's talking about things that Kant noticed later on are entirely imaginary things in the mind, soul, cosmos, world, these things that are like not the physics that you experience in contact with your senses. And this made, and Heidegger's point might be here that, so we're in this tradition and we just instinctively fall into this idea of a separation of us and our experience and knowledge from the world, the thing it is, like that. And this separation, Hegel and Heidegger throw this out. It's like, no, the being in the world is where we're starting. The world is our experiential starting point, and we're abstracting out of that when we're talking about it. It's not a confrontation, it's where we are and start. And so he's objecting to the whole separation, which we Western, which I at least fall into, which is me and my experience and knowledge of the, that separate thing, the world. And that's not how Heidegger approaches being, right?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, David. Let's go to Nick. While I am doing some behind the scenes, I didn't realize that I've been using my work Zoom account for this for the whole pandemic, and I guess they canceled the subscription. As I do that, go for it, Nick. Talk really long.
No, that wouldn't be me. No, actually, I was going to invite, because I think that the question of what is metaphysics is better answered by the next two paragraphs that you had, and the idea historically of where metaphysics came from was because after, as the next paragraph shows, when looking at Aristotle's corpus, they had a category for logic, physics, and ethics, and there was this whole set of other stuff they couldn't they couldn't place. They had difficulty placing, and it was a kind of proto-philosophy, as described as a prote-philosophia. But anyway, I think it's worth reading this. The next paragraph, the next two paragraphs, because it does.
Yeah, I was gonna bring us back to the next paragraph. Or the one right after that, but I am still trying to figure out this whole Zoom thing that decided apparently that.
So you owe them $14.99.
Yeah. If you want to read it out loud, Nick, that'd be great.
I suck at reading. Maybe somebody else.
Yeah,
can.
because I just closed
James
the
Cook
window.
is usually good at that stuff.
I'll take it.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
The technical expression itself, which occasioned this fixed substantial interpretation, sprang forth from a difficulty concerning the unbiased understanding of the writings of the Corpus Aristotelicum, ordered in this way. In subsequent scholastic philosophy, logic, physics, ethics, there was no discipline or framework in which to insert precisely what Aristotle strove for here as I'm sorry, I forgot to put my glasses on.
Prote-philosophia.
Thank you. As authentic, prote-philosophia, as authentic philosophy or philosophy of the highest order, meta ta physica, as the title of a fundamental philosophical difficulty. This difficulty also had its basis, or grund, in the lack of clarity concerning the essence of the problem and the findings, Erkenntnis, discussed in the various sections. To the extent that Aristotle himself had anything to say about this, a remarkable doubling appears precisely in the determination of the essence of the first philosophy. It is both knowledge of beings as beings on heon, and also knowledge of the most remarkable region of beings. Does anybody have that?
Yes.
Toaton genos.
Toton genos, and I have a translation as honorable genus, of a high genus, out of which the being as a whole, kathalon, determines itself. So this, I love this. I'll just comment shortly on this. I love this paragraph because it points at the out of the highest genus, the Toaton Geno. Emerges the notion of a being as a whole, and the being as a whole comes out of the highest order of ontological thinking for Heidegger. So he's basically, Heidegger is doing Heidegger in this paragraph, and just like he was doing, he's doing it in preceding paragraph, he's doing scholastic philosophy, and then the paragraph before that, he's doing Aristotle. So I'll go ahead, Garth, you back?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that, James. Yeah, the only thing, I know Brent's got his hand up. The only thing I was hoping that we might be able to unpack a little bit is this idea of doubling. I thought it was interesting. He talks about at the top of page 5, the lack of clarity concerning the essence of the problem and in the findings discussed in the sections. And to the extent that Aristotle himself has anything to say about this, a remarkable doubling appears precisely in the determination of the essence of first philosophy. So I would love to hear anybody's thoughts on this doubling that he thinks is there. I can definitely, I just read the first book of the metaphysics, and I can definitely say that there's a lot of different ideas about where things came from. So I'd love to hear anyone's sense of what they
Yeah.
think about this doubling. Go for it, Brent. We'll start with Brent.
Okay, yeah, thank you. In this doubling, yeah, basically that Aristotle has a twofold doubling, has a twofold sense of being. First one is the science of being, or as he says in a couple places, wisdom is the science sought. So the science of being, or prote philosophia, which is first philosophy. The second concept of being is episteme theologica, which is theology. And that is the being, the specific being that is the ground of the world. In other words, either nous or spirit or God. For Aristotle, the specific being that is the ground of the world is the unmoved mover, or, and elsewhere he calls it knowing, the unmoved mover. Now, in these two senses of being are united in Aristotle. However, in the modern period, or in medieval philosophy, these two senses become separated. There is science on one hand and something occult on the other. That these two things are united in Aristotle is significant. The fact that he was not able to clarify or express their unity does not mean that Aristotle failed here. What he did was he basically determined this course of philosophy all the way to the modern period. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Brent. James Cook again. Go for it.
Yeah, I like on that subject. I like this on the doubling. I like the idea that it's the knowledge of beings as beings, and the toheion. This is what is remarkable for me in fundamental ontology. This is what Heidegger calls fundamental ontology. That there's the fact that we have a knowledge of beings as beings, and we're able to come up with conceptions like Heidegger does right here, that out of the remarkable region of the most honorable genus of beings, we come up with a concept of the being as a whole and the determination of being as a whole. So, which for Heidegger is kind of like, I think at the end of the Being in Time, in the last section, he says it kind of remains a mystery. It's a question that we need to ask in the future. What is the meaning of the being of all beings? And that this is kind of like a major preoccupation for Heidegger, and I think that's what he's, and he says this originates in Aristotle's doubling of being. Thank you.
Thank you, James. David Godkin.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to get some clarification. I find this is a remarkable discussion and centered around a very remarkable passage here. And the idea of the doubling, on the one hand, you've got the knowledge of being as a being, and then knowledge of the most remarkable region of beings, out of which the being as a whole determines itself. That sounds to me like the entire discussion that we're having around being in time, which is when I think of few things are as remarkable to me as the notion of Dasein, for example, where this notion about the possibility for Dasein to determine itself seems central. Is that kind of, I'm just going to throw that out, is that kind of what we're talking about here? Is that what Heidegger is getting at here? That he is linking this doubling as described by Aristotle to the notion of being, but more particularly the notion of Dasein. Or am I just mixing this up? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Nick, do you want to take a stab at that, or were you taking this elsewhere?
I can take a stab at that. I'll do a dual thing. I think in regards with Dasein, that question that David brought up, I believe because it's a dual thing that he brings up here, doubling the knowledge of beings as beings, I believe is very much in line with Dasein, in the thinking about Dasein. The other part, though, and I thank Brent for his clarification of this, is the doubling. I think, and I hadn't realized this until Brent brought it up, but the second part of it is the looking at a being as a whole, or looking at remarkable regions being as a whole, is closely tied to the theological, cosmological, and so forth, which is also brought up in the last paragraph on this page, where the totality, or the being as a whole, opens up the idea of God, nature, humankind, and so forth as a large question, which is different in itself from being as just pure being, I think. So there are two large questions that are related, but they are also different. But Dasein, I think, can be associated with the very first one, the knowledge of beings as beings.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. James Cook?
Yeah, thank you. I think the last paragraph that Nick was just referring to is the most remarkable description of the ideology of Christianity that I've ever read, in one paragraph. I think it's brilliant. As far as David's question, I think you have to read that last sentence in the paragraph very carefully to get Heidegger's intention. It's two-sided. It's both the knowledge of beings as beings in general, not Dasein, and also knowledge of the most remarkable region of beings. Who's that? Daseins. So, which is not the subject of under-analysis in division 1 and 2 of being in time, although those divisions are very remarkable in themselves. So this is the first time where he's talking about this knowledge of the most remarkable region of beings, out of whom the being as a whole determines itself. In other words, without Dasein, there never could be a being as a whole. That only emerges with Dasein. So it's two sides to this. There's two sides. It's two-sided. Beings as beings, and then what you said, David, that idea is there. That's present also.
I like James's interpretation more than mine. Thanks.
Nick? Okay, thank you. I thought Nick was going to say more. Brent, I see you. I want to skip us ahead. If your comment, if you can say something about it here as well, we'll do that, you and Phil.
Sure.
So skipping us to section 2, the second paragraph, a laying of the ground for metaphysics in the sense of a deep limitation of its inner possibility, however, must now aim above all for the final end of metaphysics, i.e., for an essential determination of metaphysica specialis. In an exceptional sense, then this is knowledge of the super sensible being. The question of the inner possibility of such knowledge, however, is presented as thrown back upon the more general question of the inner possibility of a general making manifest of beings as such. Ground laying is now elucidation of the essence of a comporting toward beings, in which this essence shows itself in itself, so that all assertions about it become provable on the basis of it. I do want to keep on reading because at the end of this paragraph, there's something I really like there. But what then does the possibility of such a comporting toward being entail? Is there an indication of what makes such a comporting possible? In actual fact, it is the method of the natural scientists. Upon them a light broke. They realized that reason has insight only into what it produces itself according to its own design, that it must now allow itself to cling, as it were, to nature's apron strings, but must lead the way with principles of its judgments according to permanent laws, and that it must constrain nature to answer its own questions. That's a quotation. In the first place, the previously projected plan of one nature in general determines in advance the constitution of the being of beings, to which all questions that are investigated should be capable of being related. This preliminary plan of the being of beings is inscribed within the basic concepts and principles of the science of nature, to which we already referred. Hence, what makes the comporting toward beings ontic knowledge possible is a preliminary understanding of the constitution of being, ontological knowledge. I think that last line is like, that's like Kant's hand-me-down version of Kant. That's Heidegger's hand-me-down version of Kant right there. Yeah, I really love that last line. What makes I feel like this is the clearest that I've ever understood Heidegger, and I think he's using ontic and ontological in different ways than he was in Being and Time, but that's another subject. But what makes the comporting towards beings, ontic knowledge, possible is the preliminary understanding of the constitution of being, ontological knowledge. Is this to say that there is already a knowledge of the being of beings? Is that a leap we can make here? Can I love this too. Can I overstep what I know into that knowledge? So yeah, we can go lots of places here, but let's start with Brent. You're at the top of the food chain, so let's go there. And
Yeah,
I know
okay.
that I love this paragraph. These two paragraphs are really great.
They're good. The special sciences have their foundations pre-given and ready at hand. They just operate on the basis of this foundation that is pre-given. The question becomes, however, that how are these foundations given? What is the natural light that the sciences possess? Where is it derived from? You know, in a sense, the special sciences don't think about the foundation. Mathematicians don't think about the foundation of metaphysics, or excuse me, don't think about the foundation of math. They just carry out mathematical equations and mathematical thinking, but they never think about the foundation. So where does this natural light come from? So those are the special sciences. The ontological knowledge, or the metaphysica generalis, has no foundation other than itself. So that becomes a problem. How exactly is this, derived? And I think that James Cook is correct in relating it back to Dasein, because a science that has no foundation other than itself is like Dasein, in the sense that Dasein is the being for whom, in its being, that being is an issue. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. James Cook.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I have that much to contribute here. I think I like the I wanted to call attention to the very first paragraph where he says we must now aim above all for the final end of metaphysics, for an essential determination of metaphysica specialis. And this is his terminology for essentially for Kant's theory of the revolution in ontology, or the transcendental philosophy, which is what Heidegger calls ontology. In an exceptional sense, then this is the knowledge of a supersensible being. That's the third part. So metaphysics is the metaphysica specialis is knowledge of the supersensible, as to a certain extent as defined by Kant, or the possibility of such knowledge. Heidegger throws it back here very carefully. The inner possibility of such knowledge, thrown back upon the general question of the inner possibility of a general making manifest of beings as such. And this is where Heidegger's is essentially, for me, Heidegger and Kant essentially opposed. Kant objectifies beings as such. Heidegger says that's absolutely impossible. There's no object that doesn't exist outside of our ontology of that, our ontological view of that object, or of our ontical experience of the object. So, and he's being more careful about the use of those, of explaining the use of those words here. In other words, I made a big mistake when I came into the meetup. I said there was a barking dog and a little girl talking, and I said everybody needs to take care of their ontological affairs. Well, that's not exactly true. Those were ontical experiences that we were all having. So that he's being careful to elucidate those terms in this book, which I really appreciate, where they sort of become lost in being in time because there's no glossary, and you're kind of like on your own, you know, with whatever dictionary you have at hand to try to say, well, what's the difference? You know, maybe it's not that clear in my dictionary. So so here we have a much better idea. The ontology is kind of like transcendental knowledge in general, and or metaphysics generalis, and the ontical is the experience of beings. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Nick.
Yeah, so I'm interpreting these two paragraphs. I think similar to what people are saying, it might be a bit different. In the first paragraph, the metaphysical specialis, I take it as that part of metaphysics that goes into the supersensible. But that statement, though, that the two statements in the last paragraph kind of says that the grounding for these supersensible metaphysics still has to be that basic physics that I think the metaphysical generalities. And why I say that is because in this statement, let's read the last two statements, starting with the question of the inner possibility of such knowledge, which is the metaphysical specialities, however, is presented as thrown back upon the more general question of the inner possibility of general making manifest of beings as such. So this part here, I think, refers to the basic beings as such. Ground laying is now elucidation of the essence of a comporting toward beings, in which this essence shows itself in itself, so that all assertions about it become provable on the basis of it. So again, highlighting the metaphysical generalis. And then in the next paragraph, it talks about the natural scientists, that we look at the methods of natural scientists. But then on that second statement, where the statement starting with upon them, so upon them a light broke. The scientific method looks at nature and tried to understand everything and get an ontology from nature. A light broke on that. And what was the light? Well, the scientists, the people that realize that reason has insight only into what it produces itself according to its own design, that it must not allow itself to cling, as it were, to nature's apron strings, but must lead the way with the principles of its judgments according to permanent laws, that it must constrain nature to answer its own question. Now, in a way, this is like kind of hinting at Kant's Kant's thought about, being transcendental beliefs about the a priori things that make up the mind and the things that we can do with the mind. It's almost like hinting on the, shall we say, what we produce are the things like I'm looking for the word, the Copernican revolution that he instituted, that the objects that we're interested in are the objects of our understanding rather than our understanding conforming to the objects. But these objects are made up by our understanding. Anyway, I read this as a hint of that idea.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. David S., go for it.
Right. If there's a conflict here between what Kant is saying and what Heidegger is going to tell us, I don't see it revealed yet. I think I see this as just showing the furrows that were plowed in the Kantian, effort. And so I don't see a difference in that last sentence you pointed to, Garth, about ontic and ontological. I think that distinction is already part of the critique of pure reason, and that this paragraph is explaining why the ontic knowledge rests on the ontological. Kant knew that. He establishes it, and he talks about what it is to be substance. And as Nick is saying, it's constructed through our effort and our understanding. Our ontological knowledge is fundamental in establishing scientific knowledge and realizing that reason is sitting on that is the light that broke. And this realization is the Kantian metaphysics. I don't think Heidegger's told us what's wrong here yet or grounded it any deeper. So if he's gone beyond it yet, I'm missing something. And I don't see the difference between this ontic and ontological and the use in being and times. I don't see that distinction either yet.
Thank you, David S. Fred.
Yeah, I agree with David, and I would even take it further, that I'm reading into this, and I might just be reading into what Heidegger reads into Kant here, but I'm reading into this paragraph, especially starting from the very top of that, where it says, what is it? That the knowledge of the suprasensible being, the inner possibility of knowledge of the suprasensible being is thrown back upon the more general question of the inner possibility of a general making manifest of beings as such. That seems to me an extremely concise description of the program of Kant's transcendental logic, where the transcendental, to start first with the second part of it, the transcendental dialectic goes into the transcendental illusion and what we conclude about, or cannot conclude, about suprasensible beings. But that has to be preceded in Kant by the transcendental analytic, which takes up what our a priori knowledge can contribute from the pure understanding itself. So I think I agree that it's really seems a summary of what Kant is trying to do, reinterpreted into Heidegger's very special vocabulary. But I might be reading something into that that's not there, and I appreciate if somebody can correct me if that's the case.
Okay, thank you, Fred. We'll see what James Cook has to say. Go for it, James.
Okay, thank you. I think Fred's explanation was a good elucidation of the principle that Dave was trying to express. I think I had a question though for Dave. What about the next sentence? The idea that ground laying, which is Heidegger's project, the elucidation of the essence of a comporting towards being, in which the essence shows itself in itself, so that all assertions about it become provable on the basis of it. Yeah, that's a little Kantian. But the idea that we are comporting towards beings, that's not in the critique, right?
Fred, do you want to respond to that, or are you good?
Do it for David.
Or for
Because he
David?
started the debate. He said there's nothing here that's not actually in the critique.
David, do you want to say something?
It's interesting, James. I think it's a great question, and I wonder. Here we're saying comporting, and Kant talks in terms of receptivity, our sensation, and the immediacy. Doesn't sound like we're comporting. Comporting sounds like our going out towards or being concerned with. And, in Kant, I see it more as we're being imprinted upon, and we are accepting that things are coming to us. And that's, where we begin to examine our knowledge, what came to us, what is synthesized in front of us that we behold, but he doesn't really talk about it as comporting. So yeah, I do see a difference in attitude, but I don't see any, I can't get any further from this. So it's an interesting, good question. I can't take it any further.
I agree. I think there's a separation in epistemology that becomes present in the book. Thank you.
There's one last little section I wanted to take us to in this one that it might just be just one line. So this is the next page or 2 pages. This is page 8. Laying the ground for metaphysics. Where's my fancy highlighter? Okay. Laying the ground for metaphysics as a whole means unveiling the inner possibility of ontology. So I guess I'm breaking my own rule. When we're saying unveiling the inner possibility of ontology, are we saying that it's veiled because of our relation to being? I mean, is this because like I said in the description, like Kant, or not Kant, Heidegger understood this book and the basic problems of phenomenology as like continuations of being in time. So are we saying here that ontology as the inner possibility of ontology, so I'm saying ontological knowledge or synthetic a priori judgments, that they are veiled because of our relationship to being, because we have a more passive relationship to being? Did anyone else, like, did the word unveiling not pop out to anyone else as being in time, being in time, being in time, being in time? I don't know. For me, it seemed to scream that. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. James Cook?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's really where that's kind of like a separation. I put down a question here. What is inside ontology that makes it a condition of being? So why do you have to have being in order for ontology to exist? Which understandably, there is a kind of like a syllogistic relationship between ontology and being, no question about that. But what is it about the inner, what is in the inner possibility of ontology? And it is, and I think it does have to do with this idea that there's an assumption that knowledge conforms to objects. In other words, show me the facts, and I'll know everything. Give me all the facts, and I'll know everything. So, but he says, yeah, then all attempts to establish something in regard to them, objects, a priori, by means of concepts through which our knowledge would be extended, have come to nothing under this assumption. So in other words, this is not actually a revolution in philosophy. There's not actually a revolution necessarily in thinking. It has to be almost all 20th century, late 19th century and 20th century philosophers had to put the Copernican revolution aside and deal with objects as they existed in nature or in the world in some form, as does science, for example. So but he says there's still going to be virtue in terms of laying the ground for metaphysics in a positive sense. So I think that's what Heidegger wants to recover. He wants to recover the ground for this development of ontology and through an understanding of Kant's revolution in special metaphysics. Thanks.
Thank you, James. David S. and then Fred.
Right. You highlighted the first sentence of this, and it's really, I feel like he's going to rip the fabric and show us everything, but it doesn't actually happen yet, I guess. I'm sure later on, maybe, but here I think we're still in the Kantian frame, and that Heidegger's saying, well, what we're hoping for is the laying the ground of metaphysics will be the unveiling of ontology, how ontology can happen for us. And lo and behold, it's, Kant's project sort of is that, and it's mental, intellectual, conceptual, you know, it's the framing of the world by us before we receive it, and it's already given to us in categories, and that's why it conforms to categories. It's like self-generated, self-explanatory. So, I mean, this isn't grounded. It's assumed by Kant to be built from our apperception, our self-unifying nature. And that is not further examined. That is not unveiled. So if we can unveil this, we can see the possibility of having the ontology. Kant just says, here's your ontology on the plate. Given that you are a unified, self-apprehending thing with concepts and senses, here's what you got. But it doesn't tell you anything more than, so there is something not unveiled, I guess. But I don't see, where this takes us. It shows us there could be more, because Heidegger may know more than Kant.
Thank you, David S. Fred.
Unveiling brings to mind disclosure, Heidegger's notion of disclosure. And I did look that up. I didn't have a chance to go into any depth, but I also noticed that when Heidegger first introduces disclosure, maybe about halfway into Being in Time, he also gives a tidy synopsis of Aristotle's approach to being and Kant's approach to being. It would be interesting to compare what he does there in Being in Time to what we see here, but I haven't had time to do that yet.
Thank you, Fred. David Godkin.
Yeah, what I find quite fascinating here is because the word passivity has come up here more once or twice, and this notion, I think, of agency. And I think that's what strikes me is that as part of the so-called second Copernican revolution is that, or the implication of the critique, and that part of the critique is the sudden reversal that it's not knowledge conforming to objects, but in a very, very real sense, the world, the universe of objects and universal laws that seemed to be running everything, like the great clock, in fact, has been reversed in that through a priori elements within the human mind, within the human consciousness, is that we are leading the charge in terms of what the real makeup of the universe is. And this is perhaps a too broad a statement to make, but that is the implication, it seems to me, from the second Copernican revolution of Kant, is that, and this really changed things right across, like all disciplines, not sciences so much, or hard sciences, but other disciplines. It really sort of changed the posture of the human being in relation to objects and the universe. That is elevating the human contribution to what actually constitutes the universe, and that agency, and then the agency that is part and parcel of that, this notion of unveiling that we have been talking about here, and which in which ultimately manifests itself in the agency that Dasein seizes upon necessarily, and all of the elements that put Dasein into position to do very much what Kant is expecting human agency to do in its own right. So I see some interesting parallels there. Obviously, there are huge differences. I get that, but I just thought that was really, really fascinating to me. The one question that seems to come up from is Heidegger saying, as he said in Being in Time, that the underpinning, the true underpinning for Western philosophy is primordial. And that what we're getting at here is when we're talking about unveiling the inner possibility of ontology, is that ultimately we are dealing we are returning to a kind of primordial stance, if you will. And then I start to wonder about the links between that and what Kant is saying. It interests me that the words primordial and a priori have the same etymological roots, if you will. And so this is just my way of saying it's going to be really, really fascinating where we go with the posture, the Kantian's critique, Kant's critique, and where Heidegger is wanting to take that. What are the underlying presumptions that Heidegger wants us to assume in contradistinction to Kant? I think this is just fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, David. Phil.
Yeah, I've remained silent because I've been rather uncomfortable about the subject-object relationship. It seems to me prior to this, I like this sentence a lot. Prior to this, it seems to me there was almost a kind of domination of the human mind, Dasein's mind, in projecting knowledge or understanding of the structure into nature of the objects. And I always thought of it as a kind of a dual relationship. Now, perhaps it could be said that in some sense, the human ability to know and to think is penetrating on a deeper level than the surface level of nature. The structure, the ontology, if you want to call it that way, the structure is nature, and that, but nonetheless, it is also external to us and not simply one of our own structure, of our own understanding that projects ontology. And I kind of think that this actually goes back to that. I like the sentence that Brent called out the dual unfolding of I guess metaphysics, in which there is a relationship, a kind of give and take. I always think of it as kind of like, I use the word equivocating between the mind and the world, and this constant feedback loop. Now, I think it exists in nature. I think maybe nature has this sort of like structure within it, but it is not conscious of it. It just is, and it is up to the mind to, in a sense, extrapolate on a deeper level to understand the structure that produces the possibility of what the surface manifestation of things is. So I kind of think that this exists in a coexistence between the two. Otherwise, it becomes sort of like, in its own ways, one-sided. So I like this because it actually gives at least part of this ontology back to nature, and it is a twin relationship. So in some sense, and I think because of that, it's a process that's always in the unveiling. Always there is a kind of a mystery that we have to go for in terms of searching for the structure of this ontology, rather than, in a sense, we have it and we're going to impose it, and so that nature will behave as we wish.
Thank you, Phil. James, Nick, I see you there. I do want to get us to section 3. So if your comments have parlance there, then bring it up. So Kant reduces the problem of the possibility of ontology to the question, how are a priori synthetic judgments possible? The interpretation of this formulation of the problem makes it clear that the laying of the ground for metaphysics is carried out as a critique of pure reason. Honestly, I feel like if I had Heidegger telling me what Kant meant whenever I read the Critique of Pure Reason the first 2 times, I would have understood it and liked it a lot more. But anyway, sorry. The question concerning the possibility of ontological knowledge requires its preliminary characterization. In keeping with the tradition, Kant understands knowing in this formula as judging. What kind of knowledge is under the consideration in ontological understanding? It is that knowledge in which the being is known. What is known there, however, belongs to the being, no matter how it is always experienced and determined. This known what being, a Wassein, of the being is brought forward a priori in ontological knowledge prior to all ontic experience, although it is precisely for this ontic experience. Knowledge which brings forth the quiddity of the being, i.e. knowledge which unveils the being itself, Kant calls synthetic. Thus, the question concerning the possibility of ontological knowledge becomes a problem of the essence of a priori synthetic judgments. The part about this paragraph that really throws me through a loop is this line in the middle. It is that knowledge in which the being is known. What is known there, however, belongs to the being, no matter how it is always experienced and determined. So I am understanding in this that he is saying that, is he talking about ontic knowledge? I feel like he's talking about ontological knowledge. I'm trying to figure out like, which being here is he talking about? He's not saying big being, but I don't really understand. It is that knowledge in which the being is known. I'm overreading this, but I'm just a little confused about that. James Cook, we can go to you, and then to Nick and David S.
Okay, yeah, on this, I think it's it is the whatness of the being. It is ontology. He's talking about when he says Wassein, it's translated here as what being, but can also be whatness. So this known whatness of the being is brought forward a priori in ontological knowledge prior to all ontic experience. That should be clear. Although it is precisely for this ontic experience, although it is for the purpose, okay, that word is missing, for the purpose of this, precisely for the purpose of this ontic experience. We have to experience beings in the world, but a priori is our ontical knowledge. It always stands a priori. So he generalized, I mean, here, obviously, Heidegger is beginning to generalize Kant's presentation. He's not necessarily following the order of the any specific order of the critique, but he is generalizing a fact about ontological knowledge, and ontological knowledge proceeds and is for ontic experience. And in this, he's kind of, in a way, he's following Hegel. This is my personal point of view. He doesn't talk about Hegel here, but so I'll shut up. Thank you. Oh, and I wanted to mention about the previous thing, that line in the previous section was about begging the question. Heidegger is begging the question. He's bringing the chapter to a conclusion a little bit early. At the end, he's going to say that why is this ground laying, meaning our project in this book, a question of the critique of pure reason? Why is it that it is why has it become this? And is there an explanation? So he's begged that whole three paragraph section is just a begging the question about the entire project. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Nick, go for it.
Yeah, I also kind of want to go back to the previous paragraphs because that lays the ground for this paragraph that you just read. Because the previous
Literally
paragraph,
starts that way, laying the
yeah, he
ground.
says that laying the ground for metaphysics as a whole means unveiling the inner possibility of ontology. So if you want to lay the ground for metaphysics, you've got to go to ontology, unpeel that, unveil the inner workings of ontology. And for him, he makes a point here of the Copernican revolution, how it is misinterpreted. Where the Copernican revolution gives us a hint of what metaphysics should be, but in the way that it is interpreted, it loses that. And he says that in the next paragraph. With the Copernican revolution, what Kant wants to say is that not all knowledge is ontic. And where there is such knowledge, it is only possible through ontological knowledge. And how I read that, interpret what he means by not all knowledge is ontic, is all the ontic stuff is all that is apparent, what we know, or even the Copernican revolution about objects, that is all ontic. What he refers to as ontological here are Kant's transcendental ideas, things that are known a priori, these concepts and objects that are a priori. So that's what he wants to kind of underscore. And if we take it that way, then everything else that is objects and so forth will have a foundation in this ontological, transcendental, a priori objects. And in the last paragraph, it sentences apparentness of beings, ontic truth, which is the apparent, revolves around the unveiledness of the constitution of beings, ontological truth. And how Kant does this is all the ontological stuff is based on the a priori synthetic judgments. This is Kant's contribution that he's kind of underscoring in the paragraph that you just read. The ontology is based on unveiling what would be ontical objects into its ontological a priori basis, which is exactly what the critique does, Kant's critique does. This is how I interpret it, of course. It's an interpretation that.
Thank you very much, Nick. David S.
Right. I have one lingering question from before, which may seem like just a shard, but I always wonder why it's called the Second Copernican Revolution. Why isn't it called the Ptolemaic Revolution? Because it places us back at the center of the universe. The form of the world and all of our understanding is all starting from inside us. It's our unity and our conceptual frame, you know, as though we're the center of the universe. It seems to me the opposite of a Copernican. So I don't know why it got called the Copernican Revolution. That, if anyone can explain that, thank you. The thing on this section, just commenting on what you read, the ontological, I mean, Heidegger's sticking to the Kant. The ontological in Kant is examined for the sake of ontic knowledge. We're trying to understand how we have ontic knowledge. And for that, we have to know about the being of any being that we encounter. And to understand our knowledge of that thing, the whatness of any empirical thing is fully understood only when you know it's grounded in our transcendental reasoning, in the structure of our ontological structuring. We structure things, that's our transcendental reasoning. And when you understand that, you now understand the being of all the ontic things, the empirical things. So the relation, that shows you the relation of the a priori to the understanding of everything that happens a posteriori. You've framed all of your a posteriori stuff from your a priori laws of how the experience unfolds, is caused and affected, and substances that underlie it. So yeah, it's all for the sake of the ontic that we explore the ontological structure, the transcendental structure.
Thank you, David. Brent, you might be closing us out unless we get a last.
Okay, well, yeah, just before section 3, at the very, toward the end of section 2, Heidegger writes, through the Copernican revolution, the old concept of truth, in the sense of correspondence, adequatio, of knowledge to the being, is so little shaken that the Copernican revolution, actually presupposes the old concept of truth. Indeed, even grounds it for the first time. And in the correspondence concept of truth, we have a mental representation. And if that mental representation corresponds to the object, then we have truth. However, in order to know that our mental representation corresponds to the object, we must, at some level, already know the object. So that is that already knowing the object is the basis of all knowledge in the first place. And it presupposes the correspondence of truth to the object. It doesn't shake it up. It doesn't change it. It doesn't revolutionize it. It presupposes it. But now the focus becomes on this already knowing the truth, this a priori synthetic judgment. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. Okay, Phil, and end us for the night.
Yeah, but to me, there seems to be a bit of a confusion whether the a priori is within the subject, within thought itself, which projects into the world, or whether it's really in the world itself, that the objects in the world obey a certain underlying structure. And I suppose it could be that the universe is constructed in which the mind, in its own way of thinking, beneath it, it's already conjoined in some way between thought and the world. But how that's translated, I don't know. I mean, unless there's a parallelism. I mean, I just don't believe that you just sort of like make up this thing and project it in the world as it is. I could understand it if that's merely about understanding, but that may not have anything to do with how the world actually is. So I kind of think the transference of this sort of like a priori structure, which is, it seems to indicate that it's both in nature and also in the mind. I just wonder how that parallelism is and how that works. Maybe that goes back to the double foe. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good connection at the end, Phil. I appreciate that. Yeah, okay. That was a great first session, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's comments. I'm happy we were able to find some ways to connect our discussions on being in time to this section. So we're going to meet on every 2 weeks. I imagine we'll finish this book in 11 sessions thereabouts, and then we'll see when we start basic problems, maybe next spring. I'll be doing another master's in the spring, so we'll see how that works. But yeah, should be fun, everyone. Okay, thank you, and I will.
Thanks, Garth.
I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank
you.
2 weeks.
Thanks a
everyone.
lot. It helps to have the group.
Yeah,
Thanks, Garth.
glad to see everyone back. Bye bye, everyone.
Yeah.
And thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone who came. Bye.
Thank you for your
Bye-bye.
time.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.